So we're getting ready to start scene 3 here, and I wanted to... Why are you late? Sit down, let's go. We're right in the middle of things. Goodness gracious. And put your phone away. Sorry. Okay, so let's get started. So if we look at scene 3, we finally get to meet Juliet. Now, some of you in scene 1, when you heard Romeo, who was talking about how much he loves this woman who doesn't love him back, assumed, I think, because of your background knowledge that, oh, he must have been talking about Juliet. But now you should know he was talking about a different girl whose name was Rosalind. So Romeo is not in love with Juliet, hasn't met Juliet. We just found out that Paris wants to marry Juliet. And so now, scene 3, we finally get to meet Juliet. And if you're going to produce this play right, Juliet should strike us as a beautiful and very innocent, very wonderful person. Like, you should be rooting for her right away. She should just come across as a genuine, innocent kind of person. So when you see that in this scene, you see it in the way that the blocking is done with the characters. And so we're going to talk about that. So the 3 characters in this scene: Juliet, who's really an angel; the nurse, who's really kind of there for comic relief and also for some of the body humor that she has. If you read the scene, she talks a lot, she can't stop talking, and she's very, she has no filter. This is like the person who, if you're sitting down to dinner and doesn't mind telling you about the last time they had diarrhea or something. Like, the nurse just has no filter, and if you didn't understand her big speech, a lot of it is actually really dirty humor, which I'll point out here in a second. And then you have Lady Capulet, who is the exact opposite of the nurse. So the nurse is one of those people that has no filter. Lady Capulet's actions are all dignified, all ladylike, and she's like very prim, very proper. And so as the scene goes on, Juliet's going to end up in the middle. Lady Capulet is coming to talk to her about the marriage with Paris, and then the nurse is there for moral support. And so as you watch that occur, you can kind of see it in the language and see it in the way it starts. So it starts with Lady Capulet saying this: "Nurse, where's my daughter? Call her forth to me." And then the nurse, who characterizes herself by her first thing, just kind of goes, "Oh, Juliet, where are you, Juliet?" And you get that in the way this happens, right? "Juliet, what lamb, ladybird, God forbid, where's the girl? What, Juliet?" And so she's yelling for Juliet, and then suddenly Juliet comes running onto stage, and the nurse sees Juliet come running onto stage, and Juliet would come onto stage, recognize that her mother is there to see her, and then she would do something very telling. She would probably, fix her hair, make sure she looks okay, because seeing her mother is a formal occasion, and she's worried about her mother. And so that's endearing, but it's also one of those things that tells you about their relationship. So Juliet's very formal. She's like, "Madame, I'm here. What's your will?" And now Lady Capulet wants to have a private conversation with Juliet. So Lady Capulet says, "Nurse, give leave a while. We must talk in secret." And when she says that line, the nurse goes off stage looking very sad, and she's kind of looking back over her shoulder because she wants to be part of the conversation, but she has to leave. And then Juliet would get a panicked look on her face, like being alone with her mother is a big deal. So she's looking at the nurse, they're making eye contact, she's looking back at her mother, and then Lady Capulet realizes, all right, we'll leave the nurse in the scene. So she's like, "Nurse, come back again, I've remembered me, thou hearest our counsel." So the nurse comes back in, and they end up in this situation with Juliet in the middle, the nurse to one side, Lady Capulet to the other. And as the scene goes on, the nurse says, that Lady Capulet says, "I've remembered me, thou hearest our counsel, thou knowest my daughter's of a pretty age." And then the nurse says, "Faith, I can tell her age unto an hour." And then Lady Capulet says she's not 14, but she says it as a question. And what you understand is Lady Capulet only has a rough idea of how old her daughter is. She does not know Juliet's exact age. And the nurse says, "I'll lay 14 of my teeth, even though I only have 4, that she's she's not 14, so the nurse knows her age exactly. So there's the contrast. Juliet and the nurse know each other far better than Lady Capulet and Juliet. So just like with Romeo, who is isolated from his parents, Juliet is isolated from hers. And Lady Capulet is looking at Juliet and saying, okay, I want you to, look at the Lord Paris tonight. I want you to see about falling in love with him. And then that's what she's come there for, but the nurse keeps interrupting. And so this big, long speech that starts with even or odd all the days in the year, this is where you start to understand who the nurse is. So I'm going to read this speech and then go through it. So, even or odd, all the days in the year come Lammas Eve at night shall she be 14. Susan and she, God rest all Christian souls who are of an age. While Susan is with God, she was too good for me. And now, this is where you'll feel some sympathy for the nurse, because the nurse is talking about Susan, who was her daughter, who died. And so Juliet and Susan were the same age, and now you understand where the term nurse comes from, not to get too graphic, but people who were aristocrats did not like to nurse their own children. And so the nurse who was pregnant with Susan at the same time Lady Capulet was pregnant with Juliet was hired to nurse Juliet literally. So she was a nursemaid. And so these two are attached, and Juliet and Lady Capulet are not. And then if you go to the next page, you'll see that there's this big long speech where the nurse starts talking about her own nipples and starts talking about nursing Juliet, and that's all very graphic. And then she also talks about her own husband who makes a dirty joke here at the end, and this is all kind of bawdy humor. And Lady Capulet is like, enough of this, I pray thee hold thy peace, and is embarrassed. And Juliet ends up gravitating towards the nurse throughout this scene, and Lady Capulet ends up being sort of isolated. And that process helps you understand kind of who's who, and that sets us up for the party scene that's going to come very soon. So, Lady Capulet has come to tell Juliet, hey, Paris wants you for his wife, look and see if you can love Paris. Capulet told Paris, hey, see if you can woo my daughter, look and see if you like Juliet. Benvolio is telling Romeo, hey, go to the party and look for women that are different from Rosalind. So, we are looking at characters who are using arrows to compare each other. And so that's what sets up the last scene of Act 1, or the last two scenes of Act 1. And I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the discussion box. That's that.